What's up, everyone? It's Rational Vids. Today we're covering a debate on the infamously conservative channel Fox News. We got Sean Hannity going against Tulsi Gabbard today, and as if you don't already know, as a progressive and lefty, I take Tulsi's side um, on her Ukraine policy stance. Now, for those of you who don't know, Fox News and other corporate news channels are pushing for war, always pushing for war and imperialism for as long as I can remember. Probably since I first knew about the Iraq War in like 2010. That being said, I was born in 1997, so as a Generation Zer, I don't remember exactly the Iraq conflict because I was a little kid. But from what from what progressive commentators have told me, the Iraq conflict was full of journalistic imperialism. Bush was just a horrible, terrible president on this matter. And I think and people like Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and all these other, typical, 90s radio batshit crazy right wingers would defend Bush's policy of imperialism, our war in Afghanistan. So but now in 2022 we got a new war. We got it's not really a war anyway. It's the Ukraine Russia conflict that's been kind of going on since 2013, 2014. And there seems to be like three different sides to this. There seems to be a want for Ukraine to become neutral. There seems to be a side that's defending Russia's actions, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think Putin's a bad guy. I think him invading Ukraine was the wrong move. I think it was an overreaction. But then on the other side, you got these uncompromising people with NATO like Joe Biden and Vladimir Zelensky, who are actively funding the Azov Battalion, who are neo-Nazi groups within the Ukrainian military. And this is a real group. They've been nationalistic. They've been pretty ethno-nationalist. They go against like any racial groups that aren't accepted. They're anti-Semitic to the core. They almost sound exactly. They live up exactly to the neo-Nazi policies of earlier neo-Nazi groups who looked up to the actual Nazi party, like Hitler and all this stuff. In fact, in some cases, the Azov Battalion is historically linked to the Nazi occupation of Ukraine back in the day. But then you've got Putin committing war crimes against, protesters, and killing Ukrainian citizens in Mariupol. But then you've got Ukraine. It's just two sides of nationalism with nationalism. There's no good side here. You got Ukraine torturing Russian prisoners of war who are just soldiers that were sent by their mad dictator Putin to fight for a selfish cause. I mean, you really. And then you got Zelensky, who's trying to be as uncompromising as possible in a neutral Ukraine conflict. So I think the goal of this whole conflict should be to, first off, come to a ceasefire. Let Putin have his way with Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk, which are already Russian loyalist territories anyway. They're Russian separatist territories. Long before this proxy war started, which is long before the invasion began, Luhansk and Donetsk were already trying to become independent states from Ukraine for a long time. And those are the regions in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And they were already trying to become part with Putin. And Mariupol and Kiev and the rest of Ukraine can be part of Ukraine because those are more like Ukraine nationalist territories. So coming to a ceasefire and having Ukraine not become part of NATO would be the best solution because it would fulfill Putin's ceasefire agreement terms, and it would also stop the conflict, which is killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians. Like, if you really care about the people of Ukraine, you wouldn't want this war to continue on. But people like the hosts of Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, all the typical pro-war imperialist pieces of shit journalism are pushing for the most aggressive policies in line with Biden's Biden's threatening of, we want complete regime change in Russia. We want Putin to be ousted. And while I personally do want Putin to be ousted, for Biden to say that on the world stage threatens nuclear war. Russia is a nuclear power like us, and they can destroy us. They can target our cities. They can destroy Ukrainians first, and then they could go after the U.S. Biden could have potentially just started World War III with his reckless ass remarks. And meanwhile, Biden's pushing sanctions that are hurting the American people economically. It's raising our gas prices. It's raising inflation. It's going to cause food shortages immediately. So for people to still be pushing for Joe Biden and for people to still be pushing pro-war nonsense like Sean Hannity is absolutely ridiculous. And it just shows the corruption in Washington. So Sean Hannity is like your typical 90s radio host who's been, consistently right-wing on every single issue. It doesn't matter whether it's foreign policy, he's pro-imperialist there, or domestic policy where he pushes for corrupt corporate capitalism and, conservative social policies. He's just one of the most reprehensible, crazy lunatics on the right wing. And then you got Tulsi Gabbard, who identifies as a Democrat, but has been viewed as a pariah on the mainstream left just due to her unorthodox stances on war, her unorthodox stances, her going on Fox News and associating with people like Tucker Carlson, who is actually somewhat anti-imperialist, surprisingly, even though Tucker Carlson is pretty far right. But you can agree, but Tulsi Gabbard tends to be more progressive than she gives on. She's had some controversial takes on LGBTQIA plus community that I don't necessarily agree with, but we're going to watch her debate Sean Hannity and crush him in this debate.
Hawaii Congresswoman, current Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserves, Tulsi Gabbard, as well as Tulsi. Let me play a quote of you on Jesse's show, and I want to ask you about it.
Central to that humility, Jesse, is first and foremost recognizing you're not God. You are not in control. And if you try to pretend that you are, what will result, even with good intentions, what will result, unfortunately, is more suffering, more hardship for the people in the world that supposedly he's trying to save.
So
that has been consistent with every U.S. foreign policy move we have made in the last 5 decades. I mean, every quote-unquote good intention that we had, and I don't even believe we had that many good intentions in the first place. We just wanted, the economic benefits of war. We didn't want people to have freedom or democracy or equality because, Chile would have had that if with Salvador Allende, who was the first elected democratic socialist president. But then we funded a coup. The CIA funded a military coup, which put Augusto Pinochet, a right-wing military dictator, in power, and he started executing a bunch of people. What about Brazil? We installed a military dictatorship in Brazil after the Workers' Party was subsequently taken over by another military coup there. And what about all of our military coups in Latin America, such as the Iran-Contra situation that we had with Reagan? Or what about the Shah we installed in power in Iran, which subsequently tortured people militarily until Iran had a revolution that put an equally bad theocracy in power? Or what about Afghanistan, where we funded the Mujahideen to keep out Soviet invaders, but then the Mujahideen ultimately turned into the Taliban, which today rules Afghanistan with an iron fist. It's a terrorist group. We helped install a terrorist group in Afghanistan. That was us. What about the war in Syria or the war in Libya? We transformed Libya into a open slave market. We helped fund Saudi Arabia and bomb Yemen. We are no better. We are no better than Russia, okay? Just because Russia does bad shit doesn't mean we are excused. So Gabbard is on point.
I am a supporter, Tulsi, of the Reagan doctrine and the Trump doctrine. Reagan doctrine is providing Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen when the Soviets invaded in the 80s. They were successful. They pushed the Soviets out.
And he just goes and says it. He goes and says it. Mask off. Mask off. We supported funding the Mujahideen to repeal the Soviet invaders, which ultimately became the Taliban, these Wahhabi religious extremists that became terrorists. And we still support our decision. You know, we would have been better. Would have been better than Soviet invasion, right? You know, we have women being oppressed. We got gays being hanged in the streets. We got a terrorist group going around shooting people. You still side with your support of the Mujahideen, still arming them, even though the consequences of the long failed 20-year campaign called the War in Afghanistan didn't keep the Taliban out. In fact, the Taliban just took over all of our military bases because of Biden's reckless decisions when he pulled out. But no, you're still gonna sell that line, Hannity. Seriously? It's like he's still in the 1990s.
Supporting the Nicaraguan freedom-fighting Contras over the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega.
Oh man, that's even worse. Funding the Contras, the right-wing death squads in Nicaragua that shot Sandinista revolutionaries in the streets. The Sandinistas were violent too, but they were pretty violent. But the Contras were frickin' death squads that massacred families in Nicaragua during the Iran-Contra situation. You're still so you openly support funding right-wing death squads, Sean. Just putting that out there.
I'm also a supporter of the Trump doctrine, which is bomb the living hell out of people. Don't put an American boot on the ground, maybe some intel boots there, but that's about it. And with pinpoint accuracy, push buttons from all over the United States, and we'll hit any target we want, and we'll blow the caliphate out of existence. Trump did it. Soleimani off the top.
Listening to this guy makes me lose like 10 IQ points. Okay, so basically Sean is still about selling the grift of American exceptionalism. Let's be the world's police like we were in 2001 after the World Trade Center fell down. Oh, we got to be patriotic even though we're sending more of our veterans to die overseas and come back with PTSD, and we don't help them after that. Is that right? Is that what I'm getting from Sean Hannity here? Let's just continue the endless cycle of imperialism and war and people hating us because of our actions. And then we complain about when migrants come over here from the countries we decimated. Come on.
Tarmac, al-Baghdadi and Associates, and the al-Qaeda leader in Yemen. It sounds to me like you don't believe in that. We're not putting one American boot on the ground, and my argument would be, if Putin...
Yes, we don't believe in fucking militaristic foreign policy, you dolt.
...is successful here, God only knows where his territorial ambitions will take him next.
Yeah, Sean, all the things that you just talked about and explained there, frankly, are tactics. Those are tactics to accomplish what? And the what is really the central question here that needs to be answered is, what is our objective? What is the objective of the United States? What actions and objective best serves the interest of the American people?
Base, that is so correct. What helps us? Stop worrying about the people over yonder. Okay, start worrying about the people here. We're going through an economic crisis, man. We have no health care. People are massively unemployed. The only jobs that are being created are service level stuff. We have criminal justice reform that needs to be done. We got, crumbling infrastructure that's being sort of helped with the Biden infrastructure bill, except it's not, because that's kind of an upward transfer of wealth too. Biden and the Democrats and the Republicans and the two-party duopoly are ruining our country here at home. But we keep going on distracting the people with, Chris Rock being slapped by Will Smith, or, military interventions overseas, or the Ukraine-Russia conflict that's being televised on mainstream networks. We keep getting distracted with all this crap that we don't pay attention to our country collapsing like a stack of dominoes. So absolutely correct, Gabbard.
That's the question. That's the thing that President Biden and his administration has failed to detail, outline, or even identify. And it's frankly why we're seeing how he's at NATO right now, trying to clean up the mess that he made with these food shortages and all these things coming around as a result of the sanctions policies that he put in place. So anytime you look at so many of our foreign policy disasters in the past, we see they have come about because our leaders have failed to outline what is it exactly we are trying to achieve and how does it best serve the interests of the American people. Will it make our lives better? Will it improve them, or will it actually make it worse? And I think that's really the central question that our president of this country needs to answer.
You know, does the world, we can't be the world's policeman. You and I agree on that part. We can't.
Yes.
You literally just said you support the U.S. being the world's policeman, Sean. Don't lie.
However, we are a nation that has a conscience and a soul and a belief in natural law that rights come from God, not from governments. I think you agree with that part. And
Yes.
when you see entire cities like Mariupol decimated, hospitals bombed out, maternity hospitals, schools bombed out, indiscriminate bombing of innocent men, women, and children, and you see women and children shot dead, bombed out in the streets and the cities of Ukraine, does America at least have a moral obligation to assist a country that's willing to fight for itself to defend their natural rights? Because that's what Reagan called the Reagan Doctrine.
That's okay. So the tactic he's using here is exactly the same tactics that every other news network is using right now, whether it be CNN, MSNBC, PBS, Fox News, One American News Network, all of these corporate news channels that are constantly obsessing about, oh, human rights for Ukrainians, human rights for Ukrainians. What about the people that are being bombed, the hospitals, the children? Think of them. If we really thought about the Ukrainians, if we really wanted the Ukrainians to be at peace and protected from, war and killing and violence, then we would support a diplomatic policy between Ukraine, the US, and Russia on what has to be done. We need to have a ceasefire. But the people in the media do not want a ceasefire. They want to continue arming the Ukrainians, who can't possibly win this conflict against a nuclear frickin' power that could annihilate them in a second. And start World War III. We could start World War III by continuing to do this. Putin's a bad guy. Yes, he's evil. I don't agree with what he's doing at all. His reaction to this is quite literally insane. But Biden's sort of like veiled threats to his power threaten. It sets them on alarm, and it causes them to overreact and threaten nuclear war with us. So what are you supposed to do? Continue to escalate and let people continue to be bombed, arming them, knowing they can't fight back, arming neo-Nazis, by the way? Or do we support a ceasefire policy and, make concessions where we will, but give the Ukrainians who stand for Ukraine freedom in Ukraine? We'll give the Ukrainians who want to be part of Russia, like in Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, autonomy and move, or just annexation into Russia. I feel like that would be to end the little conflict here, to end this conflict, that would be the best solution. But Biden doesn't want to do that. Vladimir Zelensky has said he's taking a look. I don't know what he's taking a look at, but there's nothing to take a look at. Zelensky could agree to a ceasefire right now. He's not going to do it. I don't know whether if it's this is all out of an emotional neoconservative plea that's been harped on for years by people like Sean Hannity, by people like John Bolton, by people like Bill O'Reilly, by people like Megyn Kelly, all these people who are just going to continue to push and push and push and push and push for war. Nomiki Konsk, also known sometimes as NATO Nomiki, by fellow YouTuber Jackson Hinkle. Credit to him, by the way. But this, I mean, but his arguments are just the arguments that have been made by the media for years. So let's watch Tulsi respond to this and kick his ass again.
The role that we have, and that frankly President Biden should have carried out from the get-go in this, and I've talked about this with you before, is doing all that we can to try to prevent this tragic war from happening in the first place. Try to prevent.
I agree with that, but I'm looking at where we are now.
Lives from being lost.
But what you see with your own eyes, but what you see with your own eyes, and what we're showing every night, is there a moral obligation, and is it wise and strategically beneficial to the world, and including the United States, to stop this megalomaniac murdering thug right here, right now, with the Ukrainians willing to fight if they only have the weapons?
We have to look at the world as it exists in reality, not the world that we wish existed.
You're ducking.
And it is a
Tulsi,
cruelty.
I'm asking a real question.
Okay, so she's not ducking. You're just not letting her answer the question.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to answer your question. The cruelty is to try to pretend to the Ukrainian people that they are going to win in a war against a nuclear-armed country that is out-equipped, that has stronger equipment, more tanks, more bombs, more planes, more people, more everything in Russia. It's just not realistic. So what should have been done from the beginning is the same thing that needs to be done now, which is a negotiated outcome.
Wait a minute. Give them nothing because Russia has nukes and they might use them. That's your answer?
We've provided.
So Sean Hannity refused to listen to anything that Tulsi said before and just dumbed it down completely. No. We need a ceasefire agreement. It's not just give them nothing. It's we need a ceasefire. We need a diplomatic agreement between Zelensky, between some U.S. ambassador. It can't be Biden because Biden's going to fuck this up. It's going to be some U.S. ambassador, Zelensky, Russia, Vladimir Putin, or somebody in a Russian or some Russian ambassador. It has to be a diplomatic agreement to a ceasefire with conditions or whatever. It cannot be not give them nothing, but like Hannity's trying to frame this as give the Ukrainians no support. Like instead we want to end this entirely. We want to end this conflict entirely by doing a diplomatic solution. Hannity is so slippery, bro.
We've provided a tremendous amount of support to Ukraine, not only now, but over the years, so that they have the ability to defend themselves. And the Ukrainian military and the people are putting up an incredibly strong.
Should we give them the weapons to win the war? If they're doing a great job, everybody acknowledges that.
They can't win the war. If we give them, even if we do give them weapons, Russia is just going to outmatch them like by tenfold. Okay, they've got way more powerful weapons. They have nukes. They have more advanced targeting systems than Ukrainians. Even if NATO does agree to support them, NATO can't win without the U.S. weaponry. And even if we do fund NATO, the Ukrainians won't win this conflict. Not against this massive power. Even though Russia's a declining power, it's still massive. And their military still outmatches them in outmatches Ukrainians in every single way. If you keep trying to give them weapons, more Ukrainians will die at the hands of Russians.
Should we give them all, and Europe too, give them the weapons if they're willing to fight for their country?
They can't win this war, Sean. This is the real world that we live in. It is not It's not strategically possible to think that Ukraine is going to beat Russia. If you look at it, and then
so
it
what
also
you're
is the
saying
question,
is
what does winning
you
look
fear
like?
Vladimir
What does winning look
Putin.
like?
You're saying you fear Vladimir Putin would use a nuke. If he uses a nuke, the radiation fallout will impact NATO countries. That triggers Article 5. Do you believe in Article 5 of the NATO agreement?
I think the most responsible thing that our leaders, the United States, leaders of NATO, Ukraine, and Russia need to do right now is look at what the reality is that we're facing on the ground and the reality that the world is facing.
Sean, so Tulsi makes the right arguments here. The reality on the ground is very different from what Sean and other people on the mainstream media would like it to be, what other neoconservatives would want it to be. But the reality is that Russia can overpower Ukraine in almost an instant. Russia is holding back for now just because it's seen as a border conflict to them rather than a full-scale war. Even though many civilians in Ukraine are dying as a result of both sides continuing to edge on this conflict. There should be a peaceful solution and an end to this conflict before it gets worse and more people die. Do you want more people to die, Sean? It seems that's what you're pushing for.
Facing and come together to be able to negotiate an outcome to this.
Okay, Putin doesn't want to negotiate. Clearly doesn't want to negotiate. There's been many attempts at negotiation. So
what do you mean there's been many attempts? There's been no attempts at negotiation. That's a lie. You have not. Putin has been willing to end this war, given that he gets the territories of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. And the Ukrainians can have the rest. I don't know what happens to Mariupol. If Mariupol and Kiev cannot be annexed by the Russians, but because Kiev and Mariupol play a very central role in Ukrainian nationalism. So if Russia tries to annex those places, then that would be completely counterintuitive because the majority of citizens there are pro-Ukraine. But Russia can take Donetsk and Luhansk and more areas in the Donbass because those areas are very pro-Russian. They're tied in with Russian history. So if the negotiations are successful, then there's an end to conflict. We don't want more people dying. That's like the first thing we should be thinking about. Sean Hannity's trying to use this sort of the typical like patriot, this typical nationalist view, like, oh, the citizens are fighting back, they're rebelling, it's also so sleazy how they're using this from an anti-imperialist narrative and twisting it to look anti-imperialist when the reality is we are the imperialists. Okay? Our side is the imperialists. It's the war profiteers and Raytheon, Black Hawk Industries, Boeing, everything else, and every other corporation that is pushing for imperialism, globalism, and war. And Sean's on their side. And yet they're framing from this like, oh, they're using Molotov cocktails. It must be an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist narrative. It's a perversion of, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism.
Oh, when you see images of dead women and children,
I'm not aware of
and when you see
Zelensky
neighborhoods
sitting
blown
down
out,
and I can't listen to this anymore because Sean is just horribly brainwashed by neoconservatives but it's not even brainwashing. This is the opinion he's had forever. This is an opinion he's always had. He's always been pro-war in Afghanistan, pro-war in Iraq, pro-war in Saudi Arabia, who's bombing Yemen at this very moment, pro-Contra death squad. He's just a pro-war neocon. That's all he is, and he funds fascists. And so that's it for today. Tulsi absolutely decimated him in this debate.